And we're joined today by Clarity Capital founder and CEO, Tal Keinan. Mr. Keinan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I understand that you are a former senior Israeli Air Force officer. You're also, of course, the founder and CEO of Clarity Capital today. You wrote last year regarding the Iranian nuclear program being more of a threat to global energy markets than to Israel. And with, as we see the world now, with Iraq essentially completely unstable and Iran essentially poised to take over or to have more of an influence on Iraq and on its oil reserves, I mean, it might actually be coming to pass. What exactly is this threat that Iran has to Iraq?
Right. So, yeah, I think it all expresses itself in energy markets at the end of the day.
Right.
We have to remember that the backdrop is a very tentative exit from this global economic crisis. We're nowhere near out of the woods, so very vulnerable as a global economy. And if you look at the outcomes from the possible outcomes from the Iranian talks today, there are really three. There's a nuclear-armed Iran, there's a military confrontation, and there's sanctions working. I don't really see any other option.
Right.
The first two, I think, could potentially be a real threat to the global economy through energy prices. I'll take you through the first, what could be happening today.
A nuclear Iran or a confrontation.
Exactly.
Right.
So nuclear Iran, I think the Iranian ambitions for nuclear power are clear and reasonable from an Iranian perspective. I mean, it's a neighborhood where it's probably not a bad thing to be equipped in that way. We see Iranian ambitions in southern Iraq. It's a Shiite-dominated part of Iraq. It's where the oil is.
I was going to ask, can you illustrate exactly why this is important for our viewers? What about southeastern Iraq that is so irrelevant to this?
Well, look, it's where the oil is in Iraq, or most of the Iraqi oil is in the south. So if you took Iranian proven reserves plus southern Iraqi proven reserves, that would take Iran to nearly 18% of global reserves.
Global reserves.
Global reserves.
Okay.
So that's a big number.
That's a very big number.
So to have a nuclear-armed state having just committed a belligerent or quasi-belligerent act, which is, again, not very far from what's happening already today.
Essentially similar to what happened with Russia going into Crimea.
Yeah.
And having the support of Russian separatists within the region that they go into, so to speak.
Just that Crimea is not within rocket range of 65% of the world's proven reserves, which Iran is. And so this is a very, very vulnerable, obviously, a vulnerable part of the world. So that's one outcome that I think is obviously problematic. The second, if there is a military confrontation, I think, planners would have to take into account the idea of a Iranian reaction against Saudi targets. Ras Tanura is 100 miles away from Iranian soil.
And Saudi Arabia has how much of the world global reserves?
20.
About 20%. Okay.
So Ras Tanura itself is a terminal that processes over 10% of global supply on a daily basis. So hitting that terminal, which again is within range of thousands of Iranian rockets, there's no military way to stop that once a war begins, could really culminate in a real interruption of global supply. And just as context, the last time we had a physical supply shock in the world, the 1973 supply shock, oil went from $3.40 a barrel to over $12 a barrel and never came back. And that's a 350% rise.
It never does come back, does it?
I suppose, right? And that's just in a few months. Now, if you kind of extrapolate that to today, which I wouldn't do necessarily, but let's just say it's a scenario that we shouldn't rule out.
Today we pay about $100 a barrel.
$100 a barrel. So I mean, the equivalent would be $350, but let's not even go there. If we went to $200 a barrel, industrializing economies like China's and India's are totally dependent on the price of oil for their continued growth. An economy like Japan, so shut down its nuclear reactors, is now massively dependent on oil as an energy source and imports 100% of its energy from the Middle East.
Needless to say, I mean, and I'm going to say it anyways, I mean, China, Japan, India, I mean, these are the places that produce the majority of whatever we use today.
Yeah, no question.
Around the world, right.
So we're definitely in a very vulnerable position as a global economy to any kind of a serious spike in the price of oil. And I think that's really where the focus should be. This is not a specifically Middle East problem. It's a global problem. Now, there are economic beneficiaries of this at the end of the day as well. I think the Russian economy is very dependent on commodity exports as an example. High prices are not bad for the Russian economy.
So it's not entirely in their interest to go against Iran, obviously.
I think think that would be accurate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then we have Canada and U.S. as well, don't we? I mean, like, they essentially also would profit from...
Yeah, so I would say first of all, U.S. foreign policy. I think many people in the world might see it differently, but I do think has a very responsible component. The U.S. is probably the most responsible global hegemon, for lack of a better word, that we've ever seen. So I think U.S. foreign policy has been generally responsible. So even if it is, let's say from 2015, 16, 17 forward, a net exporter of energy. In which case, there might be a kind of a near-term interest in a spike. I don't think the United States behaves from a foreign policy perspective on those lines. And again, a global recession, let's just be clear, will really hurt everyone long-term.
Long-term. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Tal Keinan, founder and CEO of Clarity Capital. Thanks for joining us, for enlightening us about the threat of Iran on the global energy market.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.